Hello, hello, class. Welcome back. Today we are going to get into colonization and economic expansion. This is chapter 6 of your text. Here are the key terms for this section. And this lecture will hopefully answer the questions: how does colonialism increase the power of the British Empire? What is the Industrial Revolution and its consequences? And what is the difference between capitalism and communism? All right. So we're going to begin by talking about more colonial systems within the Americas. And we're going to talk first about a primary colonial figure in Spanish colonial America, and that's Bartholomew de las Casas. And Bartholomew de las Casas arrives in Hispaniola in 1502. In 1513, he became a priest, a friar, and he took part of the conquest of Cuba. And when he does this, he gets an allotment, a land allotment. This land allotment are called the encomiendas. The encomiendas are essentially the way in which the Spanish Empire incentivized people to come to their American colonies. It was a land grant that also included a group of indigenous people to work basically like serfs to work on the land. So he gets this encomienda, he gets this group of essentially indigenous slaves, and just a year later, he decides that he is going to return all of his indigenous people to the Spanish government. And in 1515, he actually returns to Spain to advocate for better treatment of native people. Several attempts at reforming the encomienda system were failed. And in 1523, he basically retreats to a religious life on Hispaniola, but he continues to write. And his writings are extremely critical of this system, and particularly of the Spanish treatment of the indigenous people. He continues to try to reform the system, and ultimately he will end up dying back in Spain at the age of 90 in Madrid. In 1542, he writes a short account of the destruction of the Indies. And again, this is a very critical analysis of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, and particularly of the treatment of the indigenous people. And in this short account, he's trying to convince Charles V to write new laws requiring encomienda holders to release the indigenous people, the Indians, after a generation. Many of de las Casas's works were not actually published until after his death. But again, this leads to the rise of this idea of the Black Legend, this idea that the Spanish were somehow worse in the Americas with their conquest of the Americas than other European empires. This is a false narrative, basically, but it is one that was kind of encouraged by a lot of early scholars of American colonialism. And de las Casas's work is often pointed to kind of prove this fact of the Black Legend. That's not to say that his works weren't important and very good and important for a critical analysis of what was happening at the time. It's just interesting that the Spanish have been singled out as being the primary aggressors and conquerors in this Black Legend, within this Black Legend context, when in fact there were other colonial powers, which we are going to talk about in a minute, like the English and like the French, and to a lesser extent the Dutch, in the Americas, that were carrying out very similar types of conquests of the regions in which they colonized. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to talk about British colonization of the Americas. And this happens in North America along the eastern seaboard. The very first British colony in the Americas was founded, at least the first permanent one, I should say. There was a failed attempt at one in the late 16th century, the Roanoke colony, which disappeared sort of mysteriously. But this is the first successful English colony, Jamestown, which was founded in 1607. And it was founded along the James River in the Chesapeake region of Virginia. And it was founded as a joint stock company. So again, this is another one of those um, companies that's a privately owned stock shareholding company, but is essentially given the right to go and colonize by the British monarchy. And when they established themselves in Jamestown in 1607, one of the primary motivations is to compete with the Spanish, because the Spanish have already established themselves for over a century in the Americas. And of course, they founded New Spain. And so the English are wanting to stop the Spanish expansion in the Americas. They're also, of course, looking for riches, and they're looking to expand their empire within the context of a mercantilist economy. So they are wanting to have access to resources in North America as well. The second successful English colony that's established in North America is Plymouth, and that happens in 1620. This is a very different type of colony in that Jamestown was more focused on money and, creating some type of economy. The Plymouth colony was at least initially founded in Massachusetts by a group of Puritan separatists. The Puritans, if you recall, are a group of separatists from England, and they are very unhappy with the English Reformation as it was done by Henry VIII. And they are wanting essentially to found a religious colony where they can practice their religion freely without being persecuted. That's not to say that they aren't interested in persecuting others that don't practice their religion. So it's often said that the Puritans were in favor of religious freedom. They were in favor of religious freedom for themselves, not for others. So there was no religious toleration within their colonies. Both of these colonies are going to have early contact with indigenous groups. And this is going to really impact not only their development, but it also, of course, is going to impact the relationships with the indigenous people in the region. In the New England colonies, there's going to be wars with the indigenous people ultimately. Same with the Plymouth or the Jamestown colony in Virginia. When I said New England colony, I meant Massachusetts colony. And same with the Jamestown colony in Virginia. Despite all of these stories about Pocahontas and these sort of, friendly relationships between the communities in the Powhatan chiefdom and all of that in Virginia. In fact, the real story is that there was conflict from the very beginning. Conflict primarily over the use of land and resources, but also there's conflict about trading relationships, trading partnerships, and it gets very complicated. And in the Massachusetts colony, what ends up happening is these Puritan towns end up trying to acculturate some of the native people, thereby stripping them of a lot of their cultural traditions, which will end up culminating in a war. in that region between the Puritans and the native people. So there was friendship, and there was help by the indigenous people. Otherwise, these early English colonists would have perished. But later on, there will be more and more conflict as these colonies begin to grow in size. All right, so along with the English, the Dutch are also coming to North America. And this happens in 1609 when Henry Hudson, an English sea captain, actually comes to North America, hired by the Dutch to map the region, hoping really to find the Northwest Passage. Doesn't find the Northwest Passage, but does find the New York Harbor and the Hudson River, which he maps extensively. Eventually, the Dutch will establish a colony that kind of ends up being sandwiched between the British North American colony in Massachusetts and the British North American colony in Virginia. And they call this colony New Netherlands. You can see it there on the map on the slide. This happens in 1624. And the Dutch East India Company starts to do business in the region. Like a lot of the early Spanish colonies and also the early English colonies, the Dutch had problems populating their colony. It was very remote, and there was sort of limited opportunity in New Netherlands. And the Dutch also had a lot of rivalries in the region, most notably, of course, the English, but there was also conflict with Native Americans as well. This had a lot to do with the complications around the fur trade. The fur trade tends to set off a lot of tensions in the region, which will culminate ultimately in something called the Pequot War, which happens technically in the British colonies, but it has to do with competition between the British and the Dutch. So there's a lot of issues with this colony kind of from the start. And in 1664, as a result of some broader conflict between England and the Netherlands, the English take the colony from the Dutch. So it doesn't last very long, but it's worth mentioning that the Dutch did have a presence in what is now New York. All right, the French too established colonies in North America, colonies that would extend all the way from modern day Canada down the Mississippi River and into Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, and this had actually was the culmination of some previous attempts to found a French colony in what is now Canada. A lot of the early colonies failed due to poor, climate conditions, etc. But this one stuck, and the Company of New France, again, another joint stock company similar to the Dutch East India Company, will establish themselves there. And like the Dutch, the French are really focused on trade and trade with the native people. In the English colonies, the focus was more on establishing sort of a self-sufficient system through agriculture or through timber or fishing, etc. And the French did all of that as well, but their focus is primarily on trade. Along with the French, similar to the Spanish, came along missionaries. And in this case, these were Jesuit missionaries. And the Jesuits were practiced something called cultural accommodation. And this is basically a method of integrating a culture into the dominant society without forcing it to fully integrate and adopt all of the dominant culture's components. So basically, they just wanted Native Americans to become Catholics, and they did not care whether they adopted any other aspect of European culture. And this is a very successful way of missionizing Native people. And the Jesuits also took a lot of care to go out and join these Native American communities. They would also learn their language as well. And they would allow them essentially to continue to practice a lot of their traditional rituals and things like that. So the French are, as a result of this, probably going to enjoy some of the friendliest relationships with Native people as compared to the English, the Dutch, or the Spanish, because they're really acculturating with them. The French will create a whole society of children that's going to be very similar to what we have in New Spain as the mestizo, which is like a mix of European and indigenous people. In France, they call this mix the métis. And these métis, children obviously will grow up mixed, and this creates like this cultural bridge between these two groups. So the French colonists are going to establish themselves primarily in the fur trade and in fishing, because off the coast of Newfoundland, there are some very, very rich fishing grounds there. All right, so all of this competition between these European powers is really going to culminate in something called the 7 Years' War, which takes place between 1756 and 1763. The 7 Years' War is a global conflict that began as a fight for dominance between European powers, primarily the British and France. But it quickly involved groups from India, from Africa, and from the Americas. And this obviously is because of the colonies that the British and the French have established in these areas. Conflicts that overlapped with the 7 Years' War were the French and Indian War in North America and the Third Carnatic War in India. So if we look at this map, we can see the regions where this war played out, where these wars, I should say, played out. So the North American version of the 7 Years' War is typically referred to as the French and Indian War. It's referred to the French and Indian War because, as an English colony at the time, the British were fighting the French and the Indians. That's not to say that the British won't have their own Indian allies, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the North American conflict, known as the French and Indian War, started in the year 1754. And it started really with a conflict over land between the French and the English. And the conflict was centered in an area called the Ohio River Valley. And essentially, a group of English investors they thought, purchased some land there, and they wanted to settle in that region. However, the French already had forts in that area. So a very young George Washington is kind of sent out into this frontier region in the Ohio River Valley to try to negotiate some type of settlement. That doesn't work out well. It ends up resulting in a military conflict called Fort Necessity, where George Washington is forced to retreat, and essentially a bunch of his men are killed in this, ambush by the French. Later, the English send a whole group of troops into this frontier region, and they are also defeated in a very famous defeat called Braddock's Defeat at the Battle of Fort Duquesne as they're trying to get to Fort Duquesne. So, as all of this is happening, it's not looking good for the English. And in fact, a lot of the battles fought in the French and Indian War were English defeats, primarily because of the fact that the French had such powerful Indian allies. But in 1758, the Shawnee tribe, the Delaware tribe, and the powerful Iroquois Confederacy agreed to ally with the English in exchange for their promise to respect indigenous rights to contested lands on the frontier. Um, of course, the English agreed to this. Whether or not they keep their promise is a whole nother story. But this will turn the tide in favor of the British, and eventually the British will succeed in defeating the French in this branch of the 7 Years' War. All right, so the 7 Years' War generally is considered kind of like the First World War because of how far spread it was and how many areas of the world were involved in the conflict. So the 7 Years' War began, actually, the official one, not the North American branch, began in Europe in 1756 when Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Saxony and annexed the area as part of his broader plan to expand Prussian territory. In response, France, Spain, and Russia joined forces with Austria to oppose him. Great Britain allied itself with Prussia to maintain the balance of power in Europe. This is a situation in which competing nations have approximately equal military power. So this was something that was very critical and a key feature of British foreign policy. And it was essentially meant to prevent any type of domination of one nation in Europe. Military alliances thus transformed what could have been a small border dispute in Europe into a major war that quickly spread throughout the world. This sounds a little bit like World War I. Okay, in 1758, a British expeditionary force captured the French outposts of Senegal in West Africa, and other French outposts were taken during a series of subsequent offenses. And this basically allows for the British to have an upper hand against the French, at least monetarily, because the British are going to lose a lot of valuable trading ports along the West African coast. It also deprives the French of critical military forts as well along the West African coast. In Asia, the British East India Company, which we talked about before, a joint stock company founded in 1600 with the original goal of trading in the Indian Ocean, was now providing the British with a much stronger economic as well as military and diplomatic foundation than their French rivals had in that region in the Indian Ocean. To try to prevent the British from having the advantage in the Indian Ocean, the French essentially formed an alliance with the Mughal Empire. We talked about the Mughals. That was the first thing that we talked about in this class. And we know that at its height, the Mughal Empire had once ruled, 150 million people across 1.5 million square miles. The British defeat the French forces in 1761, however, when they captured Pondicherry, the most important French outpost in India. The Mughals will continue to resist British domination in India, however, moving forward. So despite the fact that the British are, have gained power and momentum in India as a result of this broader conflict known as the 7 Years' War, the Mughals are still going to continue to try to hold on to power in India. In 1762, the British launched attacks on Spanish colonies in Asia and in the Caribbean. They captured the port at Manila in the Philippines, and they occupy it until the end of the war in 1763. In the Caribbean, the British succeeded in capturing Havana, Cuba. This is, of course, one of the most important ports in the Western Hemisphere and controls a very lucrative sugar trade by the Spanish. The British will occupy it until the end of the conflict. When the conflict ends, and it ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, there will be major territorial concessions given to the British, including all of French Canada. And the result of this is that some of the Canadians, or the French Canadians, also known as the Acadians, will actually be removed from Canada, brought to Louisiana, where they will, and their descendants will become the Cajuns. So disease kills most of the combatants. About 1 million people are going to die as a result of this broader 7 Years' War conflicts, and there's lots of pillaging and destruction to towns. So this was considered, and is still considered, really the first major World War conflict. All right, so now we're going to turn to talking about the British in India, specifically after their victory in the 7 Years' War. They really start to focus on expanding their control in India, and in 1757, the forces of the British East India Company, led by Robert Clive, defeated the ruler of Bengal, a region in the northeast India who had favored the French. So you can see that on the map there on 1765 map. The area in blue right there is where the British forces had defeated the French and then take over at the British East India Company. The British East India Company's victory left it in control of a territory actually larger than the island of Britain itself. 4 years later, the capture of Pondicherry by the British effectively removed the French from contention in the competition to dominate Indian trade. And after 1761, it was only the indigenous peoples of India that provided any sort of significant resistance to British rule. The British East India Company is going to really focus on the trade, especially in the spices, at least at first, coming out of India. However, after some time, those prices and profits decreased from the spice trade, and then they turned their attention to textiles, particularly cotton, that were produced by highly skilled Indian artisans. And then finally, when the textile industry and handwoven fabric began decreasing in the early 19th century, the company pivoted again to trading Indian-produced opium for Chinese-grown tea, which became an increasingly valuable consumer good in the late 18th century. This is going to set up a trading relationship between the British and the Chinese that will eventually erupt in a war between the British and Chinese called the Opium Wars, but we will talk about that later on. The British East India Company was very fond of engaging in something called indirect rule, which was essentially where they would co-opt the local leaders and they were often called sepoys, the Indian soldiers, who were often led by British officers, would go into British territory in India and enforce British law. This was very typical of the British throughout their colonial holdings, where they would co-opt these elites. This system of indirect rule often worked with existing power structures, providing British support for elites that had already long ruled India. However, in areas where the indigenous rulers opposed colonization, the British would disrupt the traditional practices and they would remove the elites who refused to cooperate and administer those areas directly. So it really depended upon the region in India. In some areas, they allowed the local elites to rule, and then they had these, Indian armies led by the sepoys. And then in other areas where the indigenous population and the elites and those indigenous populations were opposed to British rule, the British would come in, extract those elites from their rule, and basically put themselves in their place. In 1813, the company, the East India Company, decided that it was going to allow missionaries to have access to India. And this new policy basically pleased nobody in India. And it led to this alliance between both British Christians and Indian Muslims and Hindus, who agreed on very little other than the fact that the East India Company should not rule India. British Christians opposed the East Company's rule because of its stance on missionary activity, and the Indian Muslims and Hindus opposed the company's rule because they wished to govern themselves. So they had very different motivations for being opposed to this change of rule by the East India Company. But the primary thing to take away from this is that the people in India are starting to turn against the British East India Company, thereby eventually leading to the decline of the power and influence of the British East India Company in India. But more on that later. During the same time as the British are expanding their power and influence in India, the Qing dynasty is also going to start to open up its borders for trade. And they started to, with treaties with Russia, they opened up their trading partnerships with Japan, nations in Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. The Qing government also lifted most of the prohibitions on trade with the Western nations, and they created a system to trade with Western nations called the Canton system. This system was in place from 1759 until 1842, and essentially it allowed Western Europeans to trade with China if they agreed to work with the Chinese guilds that enjoyed a monopoly right on tea and silk trades, because that's what the Europeans typically wanted from China, was tea and silk, and also porcelain. Under this system, all trade was confined to the southern Chinese port of Canton, and this was specifically to limit the amount of contact with Europeans and their foreign influence on China. Only members of the specific merchant guild were authorized to transact business with Westerners and were allowed to have contact with Europeans. All Europeans trading in China were subject to Chinese law, and they were required to live and do business in a small area just outside the city walls. Europeans were not allowed to bring firearms or warships into the port, and European women were also prohibited from settling in Canton, which prevented a permanent European community from taking root there. So the Canton system basically successfully increased the trade with Europe and improved the Chinese economy. By 1833, the Chinese were exporting 28 times more tea and welcoming 13 times more foreign ships than before. And the Europeans, the tea that was the most important export, particularly for the British. But the Chinese also exported large quantities of silk and porcelain. It rejected most European trade goods and insisted on its payment for its exports in silver. The only exception to that would be the opium that the British were bringing in from India. And this basically created a very favorable trade balance with China, between China and Europe. And this also encouraged many European nations to find a way to chip away at Chinese trade advantages. So essentially, China is getting extremely rich on all of this trade because they're only accepting silver as trade for all of their highly valuable goods leaving China. By the late 18th century, British colonialism, French colonialism, Spanish colonialism, Dutch colonialism, all over the world had spread wide and far. And the oppressed peoples of these areas did not just lie down and allow themselves to be exploited and oppressed. And we see in lots of different regions around the world examples of colonial resistance. And I'm just going to talk about a few of them now. The first is really an example from Spanish colonial America. And in fact, the indigenous peoples of New Spain were really the first to rise up against the colonization of the Americas. In 1680, a Tewa Pueblo religious leader named Pope led his tribe, along with other Pueblo people in the Apache tribe, in an uprising against Spanish religious, economic, and cultural abuses in New Mexico. The end result is that 400 Spanish will die and the rest will flee the region. 12 years will actually pass before the Spanish decide to return to the region in significant numbers. And although the Spanish will regain control of the region again in 1692, it subsequently granted land to the Pueblo people and appointed officials to represent the tribe's rights in Spanish courts. The Pueblo tribes were out there for afterwards more respected. They were allowed to keep a lot of their indigenous rituals and way of life, and preserve a lot of their culture, something that actually remains true to this day. In British North America, there was another uprising called King Philip's War in 1675. This was led by the Wampanoag leader Metacomet. He was called King Philip by the English. The native tribes throughout New England in this uprising attacked English settlements, and they were destroying several, threatening to expel the English from their lands entirely. And this was something that was in response to the stripping of indigenous cultures in the area and the enforcement of Puritan religious laws on the indigenous people of that region. Moving on to Africa, we also see that there are multiple examples of acts of resistance. One of the longest of these acts of resistance was led by Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba. Nzinga basically had inherited the position of leader of the kingdom of Ndongo in what is now Angola in 1624, following the death of her brother. And she had negotiated prior to that an agreement whereby the Portuguese were allowed to engage in the slave trade in the Ndongo territory, but not establish forts there. Nzinga was also adamant that Ndongo would not pay tribute to the Portuguese king. And to assure that she was faithful to this agreement, she decided to convert to Roman Catholicism. and basically got very close to the governor's wife. However, once she ascended to the throne upon the death of her brother in 1624, the Portuguese began to renege on a lot of the terms of the treaty and insist that the nobles of Ndongo become vassals of the King of Portugal. And this would mean sending Portuguese king their soldiers. It would also mean sending them their enslaved people and supplies that would otherwise be owned by Queen Nzinga. So, in retaliation, Queen Nzinga basically encouraged the enslaved people to escape from the Portuguese. And in 1626, the Portuguese declared war on her. Of course, this was huge power imbalance here. And so Nzinga is going to have to find allies. And she did find allies in the Kingdom of Congo, which came to be her ally against the Portuguese. And initially, she was also assisted by Dutch slave traders who the Portuguese were competing against. Following the conclusion of the peace treaty between the Dutch and the Portuguese, however, Nzinga found herself unable to force the Portuguese of Ndongo territory and dedicated her efforts to preventing them from moving deeper into the African interior. Finally, in 1656, after fighting with them since 1626, Nzinga concluded a peace treaty with Portugal, and the hostilities will cease. We also have, of course, the classic example of the American Revolution, right, where you have these colonists that rise up against the British colonial rule in North America. And this was all in the wake, really, of the French and Indian War, in which the British, spent a lot of money and started to tax the colonists pretty heavily after that. And of course, they rise up in rebellion, and which eventually leads to the American Revolution and independence for the American colonies. And then finally, of course, there is an example from India. We're talking about British India now, with the Sepoy Rebellion in India of 1857. So there was a lot of anger against British rule in India. And this anger really turns into violence with the introduction of the Enfield rifle. The Enfield rifle lubricated cartridges that soldiers had to bite open before loading, and the lubricant that had been beef or pork fat, but pork was taboo, right, for Muslims and Hindus, and the cow was taboo for the Hindus. So both the lubricants, whether it be beef or pork, was an issue for both the Muslim and Hindu soldiers, Sepoy soldiers. The British attempted to correct the problem by using another lubricant, but Indian troops remained suspicious, and some began to believe that the British were intentionally using lubricants made of offensive materials to emasculate the Sepoys. So in March of 1857, a Sepoy named Mangal Panley, who was a devout Hindu from a high-ranking Brahmin caste, attacked two British officers. The British executed him, and India erupted into this mass revolt. The rebelling Indians outnumbered the British during this mutiny, but the British were unified while the Indians were unable to work together across religious, ethnic, and geographic divisions. After a series of fierce battles and war crimes committed by both sides, the British declared victory on July 8th of 1859. So after 2 years of fighting, they celebrated with mass executions of the rebels. And this was something that some British officers had criticized. The Indian Mutiny convinced the British government that the owners of the British East India Company were unable to effectively govern India. The government therefore abolished the company, took control of British India in 1858, and directly ruled the territory until it became independent in 1947. So the period from 1858 to 1947 in India is therefore known as the British Raj, Raj meaning to rule in Sanskrit. The British paramountcy, which meant rule of India by the British through the Viceroy of India. So instead of having the rule of the British East India Company, which was essentially a company, you now are going to have the British government directly ruling India. So when we look at all of these examples of resistance, we kind of see a commonality, right? An underlying theme. There's usually some type of economic oppression, or there's some type of cultural oppression, and or sometimes both. And those two things seem to be the primary instigators of colonial resistance throughout the world. Okay, in the late 18th century, we start to see a shift in the ideas surrounding the economics of nations. And there starts to be a shift away from the heavily regulated mercantilistic economies to a more capitalist economy. This is often referred to as laissez-faire economics, which is kind of like economics without government intervention. We talked about mercantilism before and how controlling it was. And mercantilist economies are always looking for a favorable trade balance. They're always looking to expand their resources so that they don't have to get resources or goods from other countries. The person that is really promoting these ideas and setting down the philosophical foundation for these ideas is Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations book. And basically, Adam Smith's ideas challenged the established mercantilist economic order and also attracted critics. Some governmental leaders were understandably hesitant to surrender their power to the free market. So some of the country's leaders did not want to surrender that power. They wanted to continue to pursue this favorable trade balance. Other world leaders, and most notably in England, rejected those criticisms and embraced Smith's ideas, which promised greater potential freedoms and profits for the nation's wealthiest citizens. And they became the dominant force in British politics. That then led to an influence in what will become the United States. Smith's ideas, the economy, were very influential in the United States. And so right as these ideas are basically being introduced, the United States is essentially established through the American Revolution. And so therefore, the United States will become the first truly capitalist country. Capitalism is essentially an economic system in which private individuals and companies own the means of production, such as factories and farms, and free, unregulated markets set the value of most goods and services based on the law of supply and demand. Okay, do people want it? Do people not want it? Right? That's going to determine how much goods are being produced. Smith's ideas are going to form the basis of this. And the idea being that part of his idea was that this would potentially eliminate slave labor. And this is because Smith believed that it was actually more expensive to have an enslaved workforce than it would be to have just a paid labor workforce where you don't have to worry about, providing them with essential goods. You could just pay them a wage. So that was part of his argument in The Wealth of Nations. His ideas are very influential even today, but many modern scholars criticize them In contrast to his reliance on rational choice theory, they argue that people do not always behave rationally or make the best decisions. So, his idea about supply and demand and how that will balance out economies, some critics say, well, people don't always make rational decisions. And then others will condemn him on moral failings of the invisible hand, which basically sacrifice some well-being in the lives of, enslaved people, poor workers, colonial subjects to provide elites with profit. So he may have envisioned that a free market economy could potentially eliminate slavery, but indeed that didn't happen, right? United States, perfect example. United States embraces capitalism, but it still continues to have slavery until 1865. Along with all of the changes in philosophy around economies, right alongside it in the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution is going to happen. And the Industrial Revolution is basically a time period in which human power is replaced by machine power. And typically that's done through, at least initially, through steam. And this will create mechanized machines that, like I said, replace human power, which then can output goods at a much quicker rate, which then could potentially be brought to the market at a cheaper, more affordable price. Um, Along with the Industrial Revolution, of course, comes a whole host of changes, including the rise of the wage worker, including the rise of environmental problems because of pollution, etc. We really see this beginning in England in the late 18th century with the invention of the steam engine. Initially, the steam engine was invented to power pumps to get water out of mines, because part of the problem with mines was that they could accumulate a lot of groundwater in them. So the steam engine was initially used for that. Eventually, soon after, the locomotive will be invented using a steam engine. And the other thing that happens in England is that large deposits of coal are found underneath the ground, and coal, of course, can be burned to heat the water to create the steam. So this all kind of converged at once, and this is again all in lieu of this idea that you could have these free markets based on supply and demand. Well, now you have a way to create a supply, and a potentially cheaper supply, right? There's also transportation revolutions that'll go along with this. Obviously, the locomotive for the train, and then eventually steamships as well, which then allow for goods to be transported much more efficiently, thereby creating goods at a cheaper price. So the Industrial Revolution certainly was not without its problems. In fact, some would have argued that it created more problems than it created good. Basically, what was happening is that you have a elite group of people with access to capital that are able to get very, very rich. And those are the ones that own the means of production, right? However, in order for those people to get rich, they have to have a very large group of poor, unskilled workers to create whatever product it is that they own. And these workers were subject to really horrific abuses, working long hours, paid extremely poorly, hazardous working conditions. And when we're talking about working long hours, we're talking about at minimum 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, sometimes more than that. Obviously, this is also going to lead to environmental destruction, which I mentioned earlier. The pollution from the mechanization, from the factories, polluting the land, polluting the waterways, etc. So all of this happens very rapidly, like within the course of 50 years. And because of that, there are going to be some pretty intense responses to it. And one example of that is the Luddite movement in England. So in 1811, basically a secretive group of textile workers calling themselves the Luddites began destroying textile machinery, and they would go out and riot. They would set fires in response to the industrialization and mechanization of their workplaces. They took their name from a mythical figure by the name of Ned Ludd, and he was a worker who supposedly destroyed mechanized loom rather than submit to his working conditions or to industrialization. This legend really grew into like almost like a Robin Hood like figure, and they started to call him King Ludd. Saying that he lived in Sherwood Forest and he fought corrupt industrialists, just as Robin Hood had done, fighting the corrupt authorities during the Middle Ages. British leaders are going to react very swiftly to the Luddites, calling them, basically a mob worthy of execution. And eventually the Parliament will make sabotage of any sort of industrial equipment a capital offense, meaning you could be killed or you could be put to death for committing these offenses. British authorities will hang many of the Luddites, the leaders of the Luddite movement, and exile many more to prison colonies, such as those in Australia. By 1816, essentially, the industrialists had defeated the Luddites. Today, of course, the term Luddite is often used to describe somebody who is anti-technological change or anti-technology. Okay, so inspired by the abuses and problems that were brought on by the Industrial Revolution, a man by the name of Karl Marx, who was born in 1818 in Germany, decides through his study of Hegel's work, George Hegel, who was an author, a historian, who basically had this idealistic, universal idea about history, which suggested that the world is progressing through conflicts toward greater freedom. So, in other words, in order for society to progress, it must go through a type of conflict. This idea, Hegel's ideas, inspire Karl Marx, along with his co-author Friedrich Engels, to write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Essentially, what this does, it's a small book. It lays out the problems that he sees with capitalism, with industrialization, and the book itself is really envisioning a type of utopia. Um, and he believes, along with Engels, that in order for this utopia to happen, that this class conflict will have to take place. And as it evolves, it will naturally lead to a classless society. One of the steps to making it to a classless society is socialism. And so Marxism and communism and socialism, they're all related. And in fact, countries that embrace socialism are also inspired by Marx's work. Socialism, Marx said, was a system in which the public, not the private companies or individuals, own the means of production. In many socialist countries today, for example, you'll have, healthcare being owned by the state. You'll have any type of utility company being owned by the state. You'll have all of the education being owned by the state, right? Instead of having all of that in the hands of private individuals. In the philosophy found in the Communist Manifesto, socialism was just one phase of the transition from the private ownership characteristic of capitalism to the completely classless society of communism. And in the opinion of Marx and Engels, it could be argued that you need to go through that phase of socialism before you can actually reach a true communist utopia. They called for the forcible overthrow of current societies, and they essentially were taking the stance that capitalism, industrialization were all bad for societies, and especially because of the exploitation of workers. They wrote another book called Das Kapital, published in 1867, and it's one of the most often cited sources on economics and politics in the world. In Das Kapital, Marx argued that the bourgeoisie, or members of the social class that own the means of production, were primarily motivated by the desire to exploit laborers. And in his view, employers paid wages to their workers, also known as the proletariat, that were far less than their labor was worth. Then they kept the excesses value by the wage earners, essentially making a profit on the labor of people and not paying them their fair share. This then, of course, leads to what he was talking about in the Communist Manifesto, which is the class conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So this is sort of the basis of both socialist thinking and communist thinking. Of course, we know that Marxism is very influential, not only in the history because of the various revolutions that it inspires, but also because it is a philosophy that is embraced in terms of the way in which people analyze history. For those reasons, it's very important to understand that both capitalism and Marxism or communism or socialism, all of these are political philosophies that were really being explored during this time period, really emerging, beginning in the late 18th century and then into the 19th century, really reacting to the rapid changes that were taking place during this time period, both with the colonization of the world, but also with the industrialization of the world as well. All right, that is all for today. See you next time. Bye.